You think you know how a heart breaks. You picture screaming matches in rain-swept courtyards or tear-stained letters thrown onto a roaring fire. But real heartbreak is quieter than that. It's the dull scrape of a silver knife against a porcelain plate. It's the muffled sound of a voice traveling through a foot of stone and plaster. It's standing in a drafty gaslit hallway, clutching the heavy velvet of your skirts, and hearing the man you married tell his mother, "She is nothing to me." The corridor leading to the private family dining room at Oakhaven was famously cold. It was a long, narrow stretch of stone, lined with the gloomy portraits of men who had fought in wars no one remembered, and women who had died in childbirth. Beatrice hated this hallway. The air here always felt damp, carrying the faint metallic scent of old armor and the beeswax used to polish the wainscoting. Tonight, the cold was a physical weight against her bare collarbones. She was late. Her maid, a nervous girl with heavy hands, had snapped a lace on her bodice, requiring a frantic 15-minute repair. Beatrice had hurried down the stairs, the heavy emerald silk of her gown rustling too loudly in the quiet house, her stomach tight with the familiar anxiety of keeping her mother-in-law waiting. She reached the heavy oak door. It was heavy, dark, and intricately carved, and it was open. Just a fraction. A sliver of warm, golden light bled out onto the gray flagstones, accompanied by the clinking of crystal and the low murmur of voices. Beatrice raised her hand to push the door open, to offer her apologies for the delay. Her fingers grazed the cold brass of the handle. "You indulge her, William," a voice said. Beatrice froze. It was Eleanor, the Dowager Duchess. Her voice was like dry leaves scraping across pavement. Thin, brittle, and impossible to ignore. "I hardly see how," William replied. His voice was a low rumble that vibrated through the gap in the door. The sound of it usually settled something anxious in Beatrice's chest. Not tonight. "She is entirely unremarkable," Eleanor continued. The clatter of a fork hitting a plate punctuated the sentence. "She sits in the parlor like a piece of misplaced furniture. She doesn't ride. Her French is atrocious. And she looks at you with those wide, pitiful eyes like a stray dog begging for a scrap of meat from the butcher's floor. It is embarrassing. You need a duchess, William, a woman with spine, a woman who commands a room, not whatever it is Lord Linfield sold us." Beatrice stopped breathing. Her hand hovered an inch from the brass knob. She waited for the defense. She waited for her husband to speak up. He was not a warm man, but he was a just one. He was the man who had ordered the carriages padded because he noticed she got motion sick. He was the man who had stood by her in front of the altar and sworn an oath. She waited for him to say she was gentle, or that she was trying, or at the very least that she was his wife and deserving of respect. A heavy silence stretched. The grandfather clock at the end of the hall ticked. 1, 2, 3. "She is adequate for the estate's needs," William said finally. The boredom in his tone was absolute. It wasn't defensive, it wasn't angry, it was indifferent. "The Linfield land secures our southern borders. She is healthy enough to provide an heir. Beyond that, I don't care if she sits in the parlor for the rest of her life." "William." "Enough, Mother." The scrape of his chair pushing back against the floorboards was loud. "You fret over shadows. She serves her purpose. But as for the rest of it, she's nothing to me. Merely a signature on a contract. Now pass the salt." "She's nothing to me." Beatrice didn't gasp. Her knees didn't buckle. She didn't burst into the room and throw her wine in his face. She simply stood there, perfectly still, as the world sharply rearranged itself around her. She felt the exact spot where the velvet corset dug into her lower ribs. She smelled the roasted lamb and mint sauce wafting from the dining room. She noticed, with strange clarity, a single cobweb swaying in the corner of the doorframe. A hot, sour wave of nausea rolled through her stomach, tasting metallic in the back of her throat. It wasn't the words themselves that devastated her. She knew theirs was a marriage of convenience. It was the casual cruelty of his indifference. It was the realization of her own monumental stupidity. For 2 years, she had built a quiet, pathetic little religion out of William's scraps. When he touched her lower back to guide her through a doorway, she had told herself it was affection. When he bought her a book of poetry, she had spent hours looking for hidden meanings in the text, ignoring the fact that his secretary had likely purchased it. She had loved him, quietly, desperately, and entirely alone. She slowly lowered her hand from the doorknob. The brass had left a cold ring on her palm. Will she be joining us, or are we to eat the roast cold? Eleanor's voice drifted out again. I will send a footman to her rooms, William replied, his mouth clearly full. Beatrice took a step back. The silk of her skirt rustled, sounding like a scream in the silent hall, but they didn't hear it. She turned and walked back the way she came. She didn't run. She placed one foot in front of the other, careful, measured, like a woman walking away from a live bomb. The hallway was freezing. It always was. But for the first time since she arrived at Oakhaven, Beatrice realized the draft wasn't coming from the windows. It was coming from the foundation. The fire in Beatrice's bedchamber had burned down to embers, casting long, erratic shadows across the damask wallpaper. She stood in the center of the room, staring at the vanity mirror. "Shall I brush your hair out, Your Grace?" Martha, her maid, stood by the wash basin, wringing out a cloth. The girl looked exhausted, her eyelids heavy. "No," Beatrice said. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears. Flat, scraped hollow. "Unlace me and go to bed, Martha." "But the dinner—" "I am unwell. A headache." "Go." Martha didn't argue. She expertly unfastened the hooks and yanked the laces. The heavy velvet dress fell to the floor in a dark green pool. Beatrice stepped out of it, wearing only her thin cotton chemise. The cold air of the room bit into her skin, raising goosebumps along her arms, but she didn't reach for her robe. She needed the sting. She needed to feel something sharp to cut through the suffocating numbness in her head. When the door clicked shut behind the maid, Beatrice finally looked at herself in the mirror. She saw a stranger. Pale, unremarkable features. Hair the color of wet sand. Eyes that were, as Eleanor had so accurately noted, too wide, like a stray dog. She placed her hands flat on the cold marble top of the vanity. The humiliation was a living thing inside her, clawing at the lining of her stomach. She felt her face flush hot with shame. How could she have been so blind? She thought of a night last November. She had been bedridden with a severe fever. Her chest had ached, and every breath was a battle. William had come into her room. He had dismissed the nurses. He had sat in the chair by her bed, taking a cool, damp cloth and pressing it to her burning forehead. He had stayed there for hours in the dark, replacing the cloth, silent and steady. She had fallen asleep thinking, "He loves me. In his own way, he loves me." Now staring into the dark glass of the mirror, the truth settled over her like a shroud. He hadn't sat with her out of love. He had sat with her because she was an investment. You don't let a prize mare die of fever if you can help it. She was the vessel for his heir, the guarantor of the southern borders. It wasn't affection, it was asset management. A ragged, ugly sound broke from her throat, half laugh, half sob. She covered her mouth with both hands, pressing hard against her lips. She would not cry. Crying was for women who had lost something they actually possessed. You cannot lose a ghost. You cannot lose a phantom love you invented in your own desperate head. She walked over to the bed and sat on the edge. The mattress was stuffed with the finest down, yet it felt like a slab of granite. An hour later, the heavy oak door connecting her bedroom to William's dressing room clicked open. Beatrice was sitting in the wingback chair by the dead fire, a woolen shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She didn't turn her head. William stepped into the room. He was still in his evening clothes, his cravat loosened, smelling of brandy and cigar smoke. It was a smell she had once buried her face in. Now, it just smelled like a burning house. "Martha said you were ill," he said. His voice was casual. There was no urgency in it. "A headache," Beatrice lied, staring straight ahead at the gray ashes in the grate. It came on suddenly. He walked further into the room. He was a large man, taking up all the oxygen wherever he went. He paused a few feet from her chair. "Should I send for the physician in the morning?" "No, I only need sleep." "You missed a fine roast." He sounded almost conversational. Mother was, of course, displeased. You indulge her, William. Beatrice's jaw tightened. She looked up at him. The low light caught the sharp angles of his face, the dark hair falling slightly over his forehead. He looked at her with mild, polite concern, the look of a man checking on a tenant farmer. I'm sure she survived the disappointment, Beatrice said. Her voice was unusually crisp. William's eyebrows twitched, a microscopic fraction of an inch. She never spoke back. She never used that tone, dry, almost mocking. But the moment passed, and he simply nodded. Very well. Rest, Beatrice. He turned and walked back to the adjoining door. He didn't come closer. He didn't touch her shoulder. He didn't ask if she needed water. William, she called out just as his hand touched the knob. He stopped, glancing over his shoulder. Yes? She looked at him, really looked at him, stripping away the romance she had painted over his features. He was just a man who ate cold roast, placated his cruel mother, and viewed his wife as a ledger entry. The desperate, aching need to be loved by him suddenly dried up, evaporating into dust. Nothing, she said. Her voice was steady, empty. Good night. He closed the door. The heavy click of the latch echoed in the room. Beatrice leaned back in her chair and pulled the shawl tighter. The ash in her mouth tasted bitter, but she swallowed it down. Tomorrow she would stop begging for scraps. Morning at Oakhaven was unforgiving. The towering windows of the breakfast room let in a stark, pale light that highlighted every speck of dust in the air and every line of fatigue on a face. Beatrice stood outside the breakfast room doors. Her head pounded with a dull, rhythmic ache, the consequence of sleeping for perhaps an hour the entire night. But her mind was terrifyingly clear. She smoothed the front of her gown. It was a day dress of dark, structured navy wool. It didn't pinch her waist. It had no frills, no lace. It felt like armor. Usually Beatrice dreaded breakfast. It was the arena where Eleanor held court, dissecting the day's tasks, the servants' failings, and Beatrice's general inadequacies. Usually Beatrice would enter quietly, keeping her eyes down, apologizing to the footman who pulled out her chair, and picking at a piece of dry toast while Eleanor lectured. Not today. She pushed the double doors open. The sensory assault hit her immediately. The sharp scent of roasted tomatoes and smoked kippers sitting under silver cloches, the bitter, dark aroma of black tea, the rustle of the morning newspaper. William sat at the head of the long mahogany table, completely hidden behind the Times. Eleanor sat to his right, wearing an elaborate morning cap, delicately slicing a poached egg. Neither looked up when Beatrice entered. They expected her to slide into her seat like a shadow. Beatrice walked to her chair. The footman, a young boy named Thomas, rushed forward to pull it out for her. I have it, Thomas, Beatrice said clearly, her voice cutting through the quiet clinking of silver on china. She gripped the heavy wooden back of the chair and pulled it out herself. The wooden legs scraped against the parquet floor with a loud, abrasive screech that made Eleanor wince and drop her knife. William slowly lowered his newspaper. He looked at Beatrice, a slight frown creasing his forehead. Beatrice sat down, adjusting her skirts methodically. Coffee this morning, Thomas. Black. And a plate of the kippers. Eleanor stared at her. Kippers? You detest fish in the morning. You say it upsets your delicate constitution. My constitution is stronger than it looks, Beatrice said, not looking at the dowager. She reached for the butter dish and smoothly buttered a slice of bread. She took a bite. It tasted like sawdust, but she chewed deliberately, forcing herself to swallow. You are late, Eleanor noted, her eyes narrowing. The old woman smelled intensely of lavender water and stale powder. It was cloying. The mistress of a house should be up before the servants, setting an example, but I suppose we cannot expect discipline where none was taught. Normally Beatrice would blush. She would murmur an apology about a poor night's sleep. She would shrink. Today Beatrice took a slow sip of the scalding black coffee Thomas had placed before her. The bitterness coated her tongue. She set the cup down onto the saucer with a sharp clink. I was not aware I was managing a military barracks, Eleanor, Beatrice said. Her tone was conversational, almost light. If we are setting examples, perhaps we should start with basic manners before breakfast. The silence in the room was absolute. It was so quiet Beatrice could hear the soft sputtering of the small spirit lamp keeping the eggs warm. Eleanor's mouth opened, then closed again. The wrinkles around her lips tightened into a furious starburst. She looked at William, waiting for him to discipline his unruly wife. William was staring at Beatrice. The newspaper was completely forgotten in his hands. His dark eyes darted over her face, searching for the source of this sudden defiance. He looked confused. "Beatrice," William said, his voice carrying a warning rumble. "Yes, my lord?" Beatrice turned to him, tilting her head. She met his gaze squarely. There were no wide, pitiful dog eyes today. Her gaze was flat, cold, and entirely empty of the desperate affection that usually colored it. He faltered. He opened his mouth to reprimand her, to tell her to apologize to his mother, but the complete lack of emotion in her face stopped him. He didn't know what to do with a wife who didn't care if he was angry. "See that you are prompt tomorrow," he managed to say, picking up his paper again, though he didn't immediately read it. "I will arrive when I am hungry," Beatrice replied evenly. She turned her attention to the smoked kippers, slicing into the flesh with a surgical precision. Eleanor let out an indignant huff, tossing her napkin onto the table. "I have lost my appetite. William, I will be in the conservatory. Kindly join me when you have finished your whatever this is." The dowager swept out of the room, leaving a trail of aggressive lavender in her wake. Beatrice didn't look up. She continued eating. She could feel William watching her from over the top margin of his newspaper. Let him watch. If she was nothing to him, then his opinion of her behavior was equally irrelevant. The invisible tether that had bound her to his approval had been severed in the hallway last night. "You are acting strangely," William said quietly into the empty room. "I'm eating breakfast," Beatrice corrected, not looking up from her plate. "If that is strange, perhaps you should spend more time observing human beings." She took another sip of coffee. It was still bitter, but for the first time in 2 years, Beatrice felt like she could actually breathe the air in this drafty, miserable house. The library at Oakhaven was a cavernous room that smelled of decaying leather, lemon oil, and the sharp, acidic tang of iron gall ink. It was historically William's sanctuary. Beatrice had rarely crossed its threshold, and when she had, it was with the timid hesitation of a trespasser, bringing him a cup of tea he hadn't asked for, or hovering by the door until he noticed her. 3 days after the dinner she hadn't attended, Beatrice took the library for herself. She sat at the massive mahogany desk, the heavy green leather chair swallowing her small frame. Sunlight struggled through the tall, mullioned windows, catching thick swirls of dust in the still air. Spread before her were the heavy canvas-bound ledgers of the Linfield estate, her dowry, the lands that had bought her a duke. Her right hand ached. A dark smear of ink stained the side of her middle finger, bleeding into the cuticle. She had spent 4 hours tracing columns of figures, dragging a steel-nibbed pen down pages of grain yields, tenant rents, and timber sales. It was tedious, eye-straining work. It was also the most grounded she had felt in 2 years. If she was a signature on a contract, she reasoned, she ought to know exactly what the contract was worth. The heavy brass handle of the library door turned with a metallic groan. William stepped inside, stopping abruptly when he saw the desk was occupied. He was wearing his riding clothes, the dark wool of his coat smelling faintly of damp earth and horses. His boots left faint, dusty impressions on the Persian rug. He stared at her. Beatrice didn't look up. She dipped her pen into the heavy glass inkwell, tapped off the excess against the rim, and carefully wrote a 7 in the margins. The scratch of the metal nib against the thick paper was impossibly loud in the quiet room. "Mr. Pratt usually works in the steward's office," William said, breaking the silence. His voice held that low, warning rumble she used to mistake for passion. Now she recognized it simply as the irritation of a man whose routine had been slightly inconvenienced. "Mr. Pratt is in his office," Beatrice replied, keeping her eyes on the ledger. "I asked him to bring the Linfield accounts here." William walked slowly toward the desk. He didn't sit in the armchair opposite her. He stood over the desk, invading her light. You are auditing your own dowry? I'm reviewing my family's lands, yes. Pratt is a capable steward, Beatrice. He has managed my estates for a decade. And he manages them well, she agreed, finally turning the page. The thick paper made a heavy, satisfying sound as it settled. But Linfield is not Oakhaven. The soil in the Southern Valley requires crop rotation, not the aggressive grazing Pratt has scheduled for the spring. I'm drafting a letter to the foreman to correct it. William fell silent. He looked down at her hands. He noticed the ink stain on her finger. He noticed the short, blunt way her nails were filed, not the polished ovals of a society wife, but the practical hands of a woman doing work. A strange, uncomfortable knot tightened in William's chest. He was accustomed to a wife who embroidered badly and looked at him with a desperate, suffocating devotion. He knew how to handle that woman. He knew how to ignore her gently. He had no idea what to do with this cool, detached creature sitting at his desk, casually undoing his steward's directives. "You did not consult me," he said. It wasn't an accusation exactly, but a probe to test her boundaries. Beatrice stopped writing. She carefully set the pen down on the brass holder. She looked up at him. The afternoon light hit her face, highlighting the pale, almost translucent quality of her skin and the dark circles sitting heavy under her eyes. She looked exhausted, yet entirely unyielding. "Did you consult me when you decided the Linfield timber would be sold to cover the roof repairs on the east wing?" she asked. Her voice was flat, devoid of any accusatory heat. It was a simple statement of fact. William's jaw tightened. "You are my wife. What is yours is mine. The law is quite clear on the matter." "I am well aware of the law, William, and I am well aware of my purpose in this house." She held his gaze. She didn't blink. She didn't shrink into the leather chair. "I am the southern borders. I am the asset. But if you want the asset to yield a profit, you will allow me to manage the soil I grew up on. Pratt doesn't know the land. I do." He stared at her, genuinely taken aback. There was no tremor in her chin, no unshed tears making her eyes shine. She was looking at him the exact way he looked at his bankers in London. "Since when do you care about crop rotation?" he asked, his voice dropping slightly, losing its authoritative edge. "Since I realized I needed a hobby," she replied smoothly. She picked up her pen again, dismissing him. "Now, if you don't mind, I have 3 more years of ledgers to review before supper. Close the door on your way out. The draft from the hall is bothersome." William stood there for a long moment. He listened to the rhythmic, dismissive scratching of her pen. He felt a sudden, bizarre urge to snatch the ledger away, to force her to look up, to force her to react to him. He was the Duke. People did not dismiss him. But he had told his mother she was nothing to him. He had established the rules of this marriage. He could hardly complain now that she was playing by them. He turned on his heel and walked out. When the heavy door clicked shut behind him, Beatrice stopped writing. A single drop of ink fell from her pen, blooming into a dark, ugly starburst over the word yield. She stared at the black stain, her chest tight, her throat aching with the effort of holding her breath. She closed her eyes, inhaling the smell of the ink and the dust. It was working. The armor was holding. But God, it was heavy. Sunday afternoon tea was a ritual Eleanor enforced with the ruthlessness of a military tribunal. It took place in the yellow drawing room, a stiflingly warm space choked with heavy velvet drapery, gilt-framed mirrors, and the suffocating scent of forced hothouse lilies. Today, they were joined by the local vicar, Mr. Gable, and his wife, a mousy woman who sweated profusely and agreed with everything Eleanor said. Beatrice sat on a stiff brocade sofa, her posture rigidly perfect. The corset dug sharply into her ribs, a constant grounding pressure. She balanced a fragile bone china saucer on her lap, watching the dark amber liquid inside the teacup ripple slightly with the vibrations of the room. She was detached, floating somewhere near the painted ceiling, watching the scene unfold below her. "It is a shame about the village schoolhouse roof," Vicar Gable was saying, dabbing his upper lip with a handkerchief. "The rains last week did terrible damage. We are hoping the estate might assist." William, sitting in a wingback chair opposite Beatrice, crossed his long legs. He looked bored, his mind clearly on the horses or the estate accounts. Speak to Pratt on Monday, Vicar. He will authorize the funds for the timber. William is exceedingly generous, Eleanor announced loudly, placing her teacup down with a sharp clatter. She looked directly at Beatrice. It is the duty of the nobility to care for those who cannot care for themselves, a principle some families grasp better than others. Mrs. Gable offered a nervous, high-pitched giggle. Oh, indeed, Your Grace, so true. Eleanor wasn't finished. She leaned forward, the heavily powdered skin of her neck wrinkling like crepe paper. Tell me, Beatrice, how are the linens holding up in the guest wing? I noticed the hem on the tablecloth in the breakfast room was fraying yesterday. I shudder to think what state the guest beds are in. A proper mistress oversees the housekeeper daily. It was a standard tactic. Eleanor loved to publicly inventory Beatrice's domestic failings, forcing her to stammer out excuses and apologize in front of guests. William glanced at Beatrice. A week ago, he would have looked away, uncomfortable with his mother's cruelty, but unwilling to intervene. Today, he watched his wife closely, waiting for the inevitable flush of humiliation to creep up her neck. Beatrice took a slow, deliberate sip of her tea. It was tepid and overly sweet. She lowered the cup, letting the porcelain settle silently against the saucer. The tablecloth in the breakfast room is indeed fraying, Eleanor, Beatrice said. Her voice was perfectly pitched, pleasant, conversational, and entirely devoid of shame. It is 5 years old. Fabric degrades. It is a natural law of the universe, much like gravity or the inevitability of this exact conversation. The vicar choked slightly on a shortbread biscuit. Mrs. Gable's eyes widened to the size of saucers. Eleanor's back snapped rigidly straight. I beg your pardon? I said the linens are old, Beatrice continued, turning her gaze lazily toward the window. The sky outside was a bruised, heavy purple, threatening rain. If you are so deeply distressed by a frayed hem, I suggest you speak to Mrs. Hughes. Or better yet, take a needle and thread to it yourself. I'm sure you have the time. The silence that descended on the yellow drawing room was violent. It was the kind of silence that sucked the air from the lungs. The ticking of the mantel clock sounded like hammer blows. Eleanor's face went a mottled, dangerous shade of plum. You insolent mother, William said. The word was not a shout, but it cracked through the room like a whip. Eleanor snapped her mouth shut, her chest heaving under her heavy black silk. She glared at William, expecting him to defend her, to put his useless wife in her place. But William wasn't looking at his mother. He was staring at Beatrice. He looked genuinely unsettled. The woman sitting across from him, idly stirring her tea, was a stranger. The desperation was gone. The fear was gone. And in its place was a cold, terrifying apathy. He suddenly realized what was happening. He wasn't seeing a woman finding her courage. He was seeing a woman who had simply stopped caring. She had stopped trying to win a game she knew was rigged. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. When she used to look at him with those wide, seeking eyes, he had felt suffocated by her need. He had found it irritating. He had wanted her to be a quiet, self-sufficient piece of furniture in the background of his life. But now that she actually was treating him and his family like minor inconveniences, the house felt incredibly, overwhelmingly empty. I believe, William said slowly, his eyes still locked on Beatrice, that the state of the linens is a matter for the household staff, not the drawing room. Beatrice finally looked at him. She didn't look grateful for the defense. She didn't offer a small, relieved smile. She merely raised one eyebrow, an expression of mild, cynical amusement. How practical of you, William, she murmured. She set her teacup down on the low table between them. The china scraped loudly against the polished wood. She stood up. The navy wool of her skirts fell perfectly into place. If you will excuse me, Vicar, Mrs. Gable, Beatrice said, offering a small, polite nod. The heat in this room is giving me a headache. I'm going for a walk. It is about to rain, Your Grace. The vicar pointed out weakly, glancing at the window. I am aware, Beatrice said. She didn't look at William or Eleanor again. She simply turned and walked out of the drawing room, her steps measured and unhurried. William watched the empty doorway long after she was gone. The heavy floral scent of the lilies suddenly made him feel violently nauseous. He looked down at the tea tray. Beside Beatrice's abandoned cup lay a silver spoon resting next to a small, jagged pile of spilled sugar. It looked like crushed glass. "Well," Eleanor sputtered, finding her voice at last, "I have never in all my years—" "Be quiet, Mother," William said softly. Eleanor gasped. "William!" He stood up, suddenly unable to bear the confines of the chair, the room, or the sycophantic faces of the vicar and his wife. He didn't excuse himself. He walked out of the room, following the invisible wake of cold air his wife had left behind. He walked into the grand foyer just in time to see the heavy oak front doors closing. Through the thick glass panes, he saw Beatrice stepping out onto the gravel drive. She had no cloak, no umbrella, just her dark dress against the gray afternoon. The sky finally broke. The rain came down in a sudden torrential sheet, washing the color from the world. William stood in the dry, silent foyer, watching his wife walk into the storm. She didn't run. She didn't hunch her shoulders against the downpour. She just kept walking, letting the cold water soak through her armor, moving further and further away from him. The rain was not a gentle, cleansing shower. It was a freezing, aggressive downpour driven by a biting wind, the kind of weather that turned the estate grounds into a treacherous bog within minutes. William did not call for a footman to fetch his coat. He grabbed a heavy waxed canvas jacket from the rack in the mudroom, shoved his arms through the sleeves, and stepped out into the storm. The wind immediately slapped his face, tasting of ozone and crushed wet pine. He found her a quarter of a mile down the main carriage drive near the stone boundary wall. She was a dark, saturated smudge against the gray landscape. Her navy wool dress, previously a symbol of her new armor, had absorbed pounds of water. It dragged in the thick yellowish mud of the road, clinging to her legs and slowing her steps. He caught up to her, his heavy boots squelching loudly in the muck. "Beatrice!" he snapped, his voice loud to carry over the wind. She didn't stop. She didn't even turn her head. Her hair had come loose from its pins, hanging in dark, wet ropes against her pale neck. William reached out and grabbed her elbow. The wool of her sleeve was sopping, freezing to the touch. He jerked her to a halt, spinning her around. "Are you out of your mind?" he demanded, water dripping from his own brow into his eyes. "You will catch your death out here." Beatrice looked at him. Her face was entirely bloodless, her lips taking on a faint bluish tint. Rainwater streamed down her cheeks, but her eyes were completely dry, flat and unreadable. "Let go of my arm, William," she said. Her teeth were chattering, but her voice was eerily calm. "You're coming back to the house." He shrugged off his waxed jacket, moving to drape it over her shivering shoulders. She took a sharp step backward, stumbling slightly in the slick mud. "Keep your coat. I don't want it." "Beatrice, do not be absurd. You are freezing." "I'm taking a walk," she insisted, her voice tight. "The boundaries of my confinement extend to the edge of the property, do they not? I'm simply inspecting the perimeter." He stared at her, breathing hard. The rain plastered his shirt to his chest, the cold finally seeping into his own bones. He had expected her to be crying. He had expected an argument, a frantic explanation of why she had insulted his mother, a plea for him to understand. He was prepared to be magnanimous, to scold her gently and guide her back to the hearth. Instead, she stood in the freezing mud, looking at him as if he were a particularly stubborn piece of topsoil she had to navigate around. "We're going back," he said, his tone dropping to that absolute, unyielding register he used with disobedient horses. He didn't offer the jacket again. He simply reached out, gripped her wrist with a force that brooked no argument, and began to walk back toward the looming silhouette of Oakhaven. She didn't fight him physically. She let herself be towed, her heavy, ruined skirts dragging through the puddles. But the silence radiating from her was louder than any screaming match. By the time they reached the foyer, Beatrice was violently shivering, her teeth clicking together in a rapid, uncontrollable rhythm. Martha, the maid, took one look at her mistress and shrieked, instantly calling for hot water and blankets. William stood in the center of the marble floor, dripping muddy water onto the tiles, watching the servant swarm his wife. Beatrice didn't look back at him as she was hurried up the stairs. That night, the fever took her. William sat in his study, a glass of untouched whiskey sweating on the desk. The house was quiet, but it was a tense, expectant quiet. Every hour he heard the floorboards creak above him as Martha hurried back and forth with fresh basins of water. At 2 a.m, the heavy grandfather clock in the hall chimed. William pushed his chair back. The scrape of the wood echoed harshly. He walked upstairs, his footsteps heavy on the runner, and opened the door to Beatrice's bedchamber. The room smelled intensely of camphor and burning coal. The fire in the grate was a roaring, angry orange. Beatrice lay in the center of the massive 4-poster bed, dwarfed by the heavy down quilts. Her face was flushed a brilliant, unhealthy scarlet, and her breath rattled shallowly in her chest. Martha was dozing in the chair by the fire. William waved her away without a word. The exhausted girl curtsied and slipped into the adjoining dressing room. William walked to the bedside. On the nightstand sat a ceramic bowl of tepid water and a folded linen cloth. He remembered last November. He remembered sitting in this exact spot, pressing the cloth to her forehead, feeling a detached sense of duty toward the frail woman who carried his name. He picked up the cloth, wrung it out over the bowl, and leaned over to place it on her burning skin. Before the damp linen could touch her, a hand shot out from beneath the quilts. Beatrice gripped his wrist. Her skin was incredibly hot, her fingers weak, but the resistance was absolute. William froze. Her eyes fluttered open. They were glassy and bright with fever, but the recognition in them was sharp. "No," she rasped. Her throat sounded like sandpaper. "Beatrice, you are burning up. Let me—" "No!" She shoved his hand away with the last ounce of her strength. The wet cloth dropped onto the quilt. "Do not manage me. I am not managing you. I am trying to cool your fever." She swallowed hard, turning her face away from him, staring at the dark velvet curtains of the bed. "I'm not dying, William. The Linfield lands are safe. The southern borders hold. You do not need to sit vigil over your investment tonight." The words were spoken softly, stripped of any venom by the sheer exhaustion of her illness, but they hit William with the kinetic force of a bullet. He stared at the side of her face, his hand still suspended in the empty air. The air in the room suddenly felt too thin to breathe. The southern borders hold. He remembered the drafty hallway. He remembered the clink of his fork against the plate. She serves her purpose. But as for the rest of it, she's nothing to me, merely a signature on a contract. She had heard him. The realization washed over him, cold and horrifying, completely overriding the suffocating heat of the sick room. He had thought her sudden change in behavior was a bout of female hysteria, a delayed rebellion against his mother. He hadn't realized it was an execution. She hadn't just stopped caring. She had fundamentally severed the marriage based on his own stated terms. William slowly lowered his hand. He looked at the wet cloth resting on the quilt, then at the woman who refused to let him comfort her. The silence in the room stretched, thick and suffocating. He didn't argue. He didn't try to explain. He stood up, the chair legs scraping against the floorboards, and walked out of the room, leaving the heavy door slightly ajar so he could hear if she stopped breathing. The fever broke 3 days later. During those 72 hours, William did not ride out to the fields. He did not meet with Pratt. He did not read the Times in the breakfast room. He haunted the corridors of Oakhaven like a displaced spirit, his sleep fragmented and his temper volatile. The estate staff moved around him with terrified precision. They had never seen the Duke so unmoored. He snapped at the footman, sent back his meals untouched, and spent hours staring out the library window at the muddy, rain-battered lawns. When Dr. Harrison finally emerged from Beatrice's room on Thursday morning and announced that the Duchess was weak but recovering, William felt a massive, crushing weight lift from his lungs. He poured himself a measure of whiskey, swallowed it neat, and felt the burn settle his nerves. He would go to her. He would explain. He would tell her that a man says things to pacify his mother that he does not mean. He would tell her that she was not just an asset. He didn't know what the words would be, exactly, but he knew how to negotiate. He was a duke. He knew how to salvage a broken contract. Before he could reach the stairs, he encountered Eleanor in the main hall. The Dowager Duchess was inspecting a vase of forced tulips, her mouth set in a disapproving line. She wore a high-collared mourning dress, though no one had died in a decade. "Dr. Harrison says the crisis has passed," Eleanor said, not looking up as William approached. She reached out and snapped a slightly wilted petal off a yellow tulip. "Thank heavens. The entire house has been held hostage by her theatrics, walking in the rain like a common vagrant. It was a calculated tantrum, William. You must see that. She sought attention, and you rewarded her with your panic." William stopped. The lingering taste of the whiskey turned sour in his mouth. He looked at his mother. He saw the sharp, bitter lines of her face, the cruel set of her mouth. He remembered every barb she had thrown at Beatrice over the last 2 years, the comments about her hair, her posture, her intelligence, and he remembered his own silence. He had let his mother whittle his wife down to a nub, simply because it was easier than enduring Eleanor's wrath. "She was quite literally fighting for her life, Mother," William said. His voice was low, devoid of its usual booming authority. It sounded dangerously quiet. "Oh, please. Women of her breeding are prone to delicate constitutions and dramatic fevers. It is how they control their husbands. You must go up there today and firmly remind her of her duties. The Linfield accounts are in disarray, Pratt tells me. She had the audacity to write to the foreman before her little stroll." William took a step closer to his mother. He was a foot taller than her, and for the first time in his life, he used his physical presence to intimidate her. "Listen to me very carefully," William said. The absolute stillness in his tone made Eleanor look up, her hand freezing over the flowers. "You will not speak of my wife's duties. You will not speak of her constitution. In fact, you will not speak of Beatrice at all. If I hear one more word of poison fall from your mouth regarding the Duchess of Oakhaven, I will have your belongings packed and you will be moved to the Dower House by nightfall. Is that understood?" Eleanor's face drained of color. Her mouth opened, a small, shocked sound escaping her throat. "William, I am your mother." "And she is my wife," William said flatly. "A fact I have neglected for far too long. Do not test me on this, Mother. You will lose." He didn't wait for her response. He turned and walked up the grand staircase, taking the steps 2 at a time. He reached Beatrice's door and paused, smoothing his hand over his waistcoat, trying to regulate his breathing. He knocked twice. "Come in," her voice called out. It was frail, lacking its usual resonance, but steady. He opened the door. The smell of camphor had faded, replaced by the faint scent of beeswax and old paper. Beatrice was sitting up in bed, propped against a mountain of white pillows. She looked terrifyingly fragile. Her collarbones jutted sharply against the thin cotton of her nightgown, and her skin was almost translucent, but her lap was not empty. Resting against her drawn-up knees was a heavy canvas-bound Linfield ledger. She held a pencil in her right hand. William closed the door behind him. The click of the latch sounded final. "You should be resting," he said, moving toward the foot of the bed. He didn't dare sit in the chair. "I have rested for 3 days," Beatrice replied, not looking up from the page. She made a small checkmark next to a column of numbers. "The spring planting won't wait for my lungs to clear. Pratt can handle the planting. Pratt doesn't know the soil." It was the exact argument they had in the library, repeated verbatim. William felt a surge of helpless frustration. "Beatrice, put the book down." She stopped writing. She carefully closed the ledger, the heavy cover making a dull thump against her knees. She finally looked at him. Her eyes were devoid of the feverish heat from 3 nights ago. They were simply exhausted. "What do you want, William?" she asked. The bluntness of the question stripped away all his prepared negotiations. He stood at the foot of the bed, his hands gripping the carved wooden bedpost. "I want to know what I've done to make you hate me." It was a cowardly question. He knew what he had done. He just wanted to hear her say it, to give him an opening to defend himself. Beatrice let out a short, dry breath that might have been a laugh if she had the energy for it. She leaned her head back against the pillows, staring at the ceiling. "I don't hate you, William," she said softly. The absolute lack of anger in her voice was the most terrifying thing he had ever heard. Hate requires energy. Hate requires a belief that the other person is capable of giving you what you want, but is choosing not to. I don't believe that anymore. "Beatrice, I was standing in the hall," she said, cutting him off. She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes fixed on the plaster moldings above her. "Before dinner. Last week." William felt all the blood drain from his face. The confirmation hit him harder than the suspicion. The floor beneath his boots felt suddenly unstable. "You heard?" he whispered. It wasn't a question. "I heard that I am entirely unremarkable," she recounted, her voice carrying a rhythmic, hollow cadence, like a priest reciting a liturgy she had memorized but no longer believed in. "I heard that I look like a stray dog, and I heard that I'm merely a signature on a contract, that I'm nothing to you." She finally lowered her gaze to meet his. "You didn't do anything, William," she said, her voice dropping to a raw, raspy whisper. "That is the point. You did exactly nothing. You let me build a fantasy in my head because it kept me quiet and compliant. And when your mother demanded to know why you tolerated my pathetic existence, you told her the truth." William's grip on the bedpost tightened until his knuckles turned white. "I was pacifying her. She was relentless that evening. The words, they were just words to end a conversation." "They were the truth," Beatrice corrected him gently. The gentleness was worse than screaming. "And I am not angry at the truth. It was foolish of me to expect a man who married for land to love the woman attached to it. I am simply correcting my behavior to match the reality of our arrangement." She placed her hands flat on the canvas cover of the ledger. "You want an asset, Your Grace? You have one. I will manage my lands. I will sit at your table. I will eventually give you an heir, if God and this miserable house don't kill me first. But I will never ever look at you like a stray dog again." William stood frozen. He looked at his wife, the woman he had dismissed as a background fixture of his life, and realized with sickening clarity that, in his arrogant indifference, he had systematically destroyed the only real thing in his entire hollow world. He opened his mouth to speak, to apologize, to grovel, but there was nothing to say. You cannot negotiate with a ghost. Spring arrived at Oakhaven not with a gentle bloom, but with a violent thaw. The snow melted into thick, sucking mud, and the bare branches of the oak trees scraped against the window panes like skeletal fingers. Eleanor had been relocated to the dower house on the edge of the estate. Her departure was a loud, dramatic affair involving 3 weeping maids and a half-dozen trunks. Beatrice had stood in the foyer, her hands folded neatly at her waist, and watched the carriage roll away. She hadn't smiled. She hadn't gloated. She had simply turned to the head housekeeper and asked for the yellow drawing room to be thoroughly aired out to remove the stench of lavender powder. The house was quieter now, but for William, the silence was worse. Before, Beatrice's silence had been timid. It was the quiet of a mouse trying not to draw the cat's attention. Now, her silence was architectural. It was a thick, impenetrable wall she carried with her from the breakfast room to the library. She healed from the fever, but she did not soften. She abandoned the heavy dark wools of her rebellion, returning to the silks and muslins appropriate for a duchess. But she wore them like military uniforms. She managed the estate with ruthless, breathtaking efficiency. She met with Mr. Pratt twice a week. She negotiated timber contracts that left the local merchants sweating and stammering. The Linfield lands, under her direct and relentless supervision, projected a 20% increase in spring yields. She was exactly what William had told his mother he needed, a duchess with a spine, a woman who commanded a room. And he was utterly miserably starved for her. He found himself orbiting her like a dying planet caught in the gravitational pull of a cold star. He would stand in the doorway of the library just to watch the way her brow furrowed as she read a ledger. He would memorize the sharp, precise scratch of her pen. He noticed the way she smelled, no longer of the sweet, desperate floral perfumes she used to wear, but of ink, dried sage, and clean linen. On a Tuesday in late April, he tried to bridge the chasm. They were seated at the massive dining table. It was just the two of them. The space between them felt like a physical expanse of Arctic ice. The only sound was the clinking of silver forks against porcelain. William reached beside his chair and lifted a heavy, leather-bound volume he had sent to London for. He slid it across the polished mahogany. It stopped an inch from Beatrice's plate. She looked at it, then up at him. Her eyes were blank, polite. "What is this?" she asked. Her voice was crisp, lacking any edge of curiosity. It is Townsend's new treatise on soil composition and crop rotation," William said. His chest felt uncomfortably tight. He felt like a boy handing over a pathetic wilted wildflower. "I noticed you were referencing an older edition in the library. This one includes the recent surveys from the northern counties." Beatrice looked down at the book. 2 months ago, a gift like this would have sent her into a quiet frenzy of joy. She would have traced his name on the inside cover. She would have stayed up all night reading it, just to have something to discuss with him the next day. Now she reached out and rested 2 fingers on the leather cover. She didn't open it. "Thank you," she said evenly. "That is very practical of you. I will have Pratt add it to the estate library inventory tomorrow." She went back to slicing her roasted pheasant. William felt a hot, physical ache in the back of his throat. He looked at his own plate. The meat tasted like ash and salt. "You don't have to inventory it," he said, his voice dropping, cracking slightly on the edges. "It was a gift, Beatrice. For you." She paused, her knife resting against the meat. She didn't look up immediately. When she did, her gaze was so profoundly tired it made him want to look away. "I prefer to keep the estate ledgers accurate, William," she replied softly. "When one is dealing with assets, it is best not to blur the lines with sentiment. Zio." She used his own logic, his own brutal vocabulary, to bleed him dry. And he let her, because he had handed her the knife. He sat back in his chair, the heavy silence of the dining room pressing against his eardrums. He watched her eat, methodical and detached, and realized that his mother had been wrong. Beatrice wasn't a piece of misplaced furniture. She was the entire house. And he was just a ghost haunting the hallways, completely locked out of the rooms that mattered. May brought heavy, warm rains that washed the last of the mud from the carriage drives. It was late evening, the sky a deep, bruised indigo, and the rain was drumming a steady, rhythmic beat against the tall windows of the library. Beatrice was at the desk, a single oil lamp illuminating the sharp line of her jaw and the dark ink on her fingers. She was drafting a letter to the Linfield foreman. The heavy door opened without a knock. William stepped into the room. He wasn't wearing his evening coat. His waistcoat was unbuttoned, his cravat loose and hanging around his neck. He looked ragged. The dark circles under his eyes rivaled hers from the winter. He smelled faintly of brandy, though he walked perfectly straight. Beatrice set her pen down. She didn't sigh, but the deliberate way she capped the inkwell conveyed her exhaustion with his presence. "The steward's reports are already on your desk in the study," she said smoothly. "If there is a discrepancy—" "There is no discrepancy," William interrupted. He walked across the Persian rug. He didn't stop on the other side of the desk. He walked around it, invading her space, entering the small pool of yellow lamplight. Beatrice stiffened, her spine pressing against the back of the leather chair. She looked up at him, her armor instantly snapping into place. William reached into the inside pocket of his waistcoat. He pulled out a thick sheaf of heavy vellum papers, folded into thirds and sealed with red wax. He dropped them onto the ledger she was working on. The wax hit the canvas with a heavy, final thwack. Beatrice looked at the documents. She recognized the thick, looping handwriting of William's London solicitors. "What is this?" she asked. "Open it." She hesitated. For the first time in months, a flicker of genuine uncertainty crossed her face. She broke the wax seal with her thumb and unfolded the heavy paper. Her eyes scanned the dense legal script. Transfer of authority, sole proprietorship, severance of marital claim. Her breath hitched. The sound was microscopic, but in the quiet room, it was deafening. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, the mask of cold indifference slipping just a fraction of an inch to reveal the shock underneath. "You are legally severing the Linfield lands from the Oakhaven estate," she whispered. "You are transferring the deed entirely to my name." "I am," William said. His voice was raw, stripped of all its baritone authority. It was the voice of a man who had been walking on glass for months. "You have complete legal autonomy. You can sell it, you can burn it, you can leave it to the foreman. It is yours, not your dowry, not an asset of this marriage. Yours." Beatrice stared at the paper. The magnitude of what he had just done was staggering. A duke did not willingly amputate land from his own holdings. A husband did not give a wife financial independence. It was social suicide. It was legally unheard of. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. She hated that tremor. She clamped her jaw shut. William looked down at her. He didn't try to touch her. He just looked at the ink stain on her middle finger, the practical cut of her nails, the pale, exhausted beauty of her face. "Because you were right," William said quietly. "I treated you like a ledger entry. I wanted a quiet, convenient life, and I was too much of a coward to figure out what to do with a woman who actually felt something for me. So I crushed it. I crushed you." He let out a jagged breath, running a hand through his dark hair. "I told my mother you were nothing to me because it was easier than admitting I didn't know how to be a husband. But this house... Beatrice, this house has been a tomb since the night you stopped looking at me." "Ah!" Beatrice gripped the edge of the desk. The wood dug into her palms. "William, do not do this. Do not try to romanticize the guilt." "It isn't guilt," he said, his voice finally cracking, loud and desperate. "It is grief. I am grieving the woman I killed in that hallway. You told me you would give me an asset. You did. You have been perfect. You are a perfect duchess, and I hate it. I hate the way you look right through me. I hate that you don't need me. I hate that I have everything I asked for, and I have absolutely nothing." He braced his hands on the arms of her chair, leaning down until he was eye level with her. He didn't box her in, but he didn't give her anywhere to look but at him. "I'm not asking you to love me again," William whispered, the smell of brandy and desperation hanging between them. "I know I burned that to the ground. I know I don't deserve it, but I cannot live in this icebox anymore. Take the land. Take the independence. Be the master of Linfield. But please, Beatrice, please, look at me. Just look at me as a man who is begging his wife for a truce." Beatrice stared into his eyes. She looked for the arrogance. She looked for the bored, irritated duke who couldn't be bothered to defend her from his mother. He wasn't there. The man kneeling over her chair was terrified. He was stripped bare, offering her the only thing of value he had, control, just to get her to see him again. A heavy, painful knot in Beatrice's chest, a knot that had been pulled agonizingly tight for 6 months, shuddered. It didn't untie. The damage was too deep for that, but it loosened, just a fraction. She looked down at the deed. She touched the heavy vellum, feeling the rough texture of the ink. She had built her armor out of numbers and crop yields because it was safe, but looking at the broken man in front of her, she realized that armor was incredibly heavy. Slowly, she raised her hand. She didn't cup his cheek. She didn't pull him into a kiss. She simply rested her fingers lightly against the rough wool of his waistcoat, right over his chest. She felt the frantic, hammering rhythm of his heart beneath the fabric. William closed his eyes, letting out a ragged exhale at the contact. He leaned into her touch by a millimeter, as if terrified she would pull away. "A truce," Beatrice repeated softly, tasting the word. It wasn't love. Not yet. Maybe not ever again in the way it was before. It was something bruised, scarred, and deeply cautious. But it was real. She looked up at him, her eyes clear and sharp in the lamplight. "I'm going to plant winter wheat in the Southern Valley, William, and I will need the Oakhaven carts to transport the yield in September." William opened his eyes. A wet, desperate sheen caught the light in his dark pupils. He looked at her hand on his chest, then up to her face. He understood the negotiation. "You shall have every cart I own," he said, his voice thick. Beatrice gave a small, barely perceptible nod. She didn't smile, but the freezing wind that had lived in her eyes finally died down. Good. Then you may pour me a glass of that brandy and we can discuss the roads. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was a messy, imperfect surrender in a dusty library while the rain lashed against the glass. But as William stepped back to pour the drinks, his hands shaking slightly against the crystal decanter, the heavy, suffocating draft that had haunted the corridors of Oakhaven finally, mercifully, stopped. Not all love stories end with a breathless kiss in the rain. Sometimes the greatest romance is a brutal, honest renegotiation of a broken reality. Beatrice didn't just survive the Duke's indifference. She dismantled his world until he had no choice but to see her worth, handing over the power he once used to cage her. If this messy, grounded tale of shattered illusions and hard-won respect kept you reading until the last drop of ink, leave a like. Have you ever had to rewrite the rules of a relationship to save yourself? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to share and subscribe for more deeply human, raw storytelling.